For 200 years, one question has haunted the readers of Pride and Prejudice. Why is Mr. Darcy so unbearably proud? The name itself has become a shorthand for aristocratic arrogance, a man who looks down upon the world from the cold battlements of his own superiority. We see him at the Meryton ball, a spectre at the feast, cold, aloof, and disdainful. His infamous dismissal of Elizabeth Bennet, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me," cements his reputation. The villain is cast. The diagnosis is simple: pride. But what if that diagnosis, repeated for centuries, is wrong? What if we have been misinterpreting the symptoms? What if we were to look at this 200-year-old mind through the lens of modern psychology? When we do, the monster vanishes, and a far more complex, tragic, and deeply modern figure emerges. This is not the story of a proud man. This is the case study of a man suffering from a secret, crippling sickness, a condition we now know as profound, high-functioning social anxiety. Today, we are not rereading a romance. We are opening a case file, the case of Mr. Darcy. The first scene of social diagnosis lies in the famous Meryton ball, an episode often used as the cornerstone of Darcy's supposed arrogance. Yet when approached through the lens of modern psychology, the details tell a radically different story. Imagine a man accustomed to the echoing corridors of a vast, silent estate, where the loudest sound is the shuffle of servants' feet and the occasional bark of hounds. Such an environment breeds not arrogance, but a deep reliance on predictability, routine, and solitude. To then be thrown into a ballroom packed with strangers is not a neutral event. It is a psychological ambush. The air in that ballroom is heavy. Perfumes mingle with sweat, candles with smoke, and the fiddler's bows screech above the low roar of dozens of conversations. For an extrovert, this environment might feel electric, charged with possibility. For an introvert, especially one prone to anxiety, it is suffocating. Every step becomes self-conscious, every silence deafening, every gaze imagined as judgmental. This is not arrogance, it is overstimulation verging on panic. When Darcy refuses to dance, readers for 2 centuries have assumed haughtiness. But from the clinical perspective, refusal is a common avoidance strategy. Socially anxious individuals avoid high-stakes encounters where the risk of humiliation is extreme. A dance is not merely physical movement. It is synchronized exposure, a moment where mistakes cannot be concealed. His refusal is not triumph, but terror, the terror of the gaze. Darcy's behavior at the parsonage in Hunsford is one of the most perplexing elements of his character arc. Day after day, he subjects himself to long, deliberate walks across the Kent countryside, only to sit awkwardly in a room with Elizabeth for a few minutes, often without uttering more than a handful of words. For critics who label him proud, this conduct appears absurd. What aristocrat wastes his dignity on such repetitive, meaningless visits? But if read as symptomatic behavior, it aligns closely with obsessive-compulsive patterns and the anxious rituals that accompany them. In clinical observation, socially anxious individuals frequently create exposure loops, repeatedly putting themselves in situations of discomfort not to enjoy them, but in the desperate hope of mastering their fear. Darcy's visits have this quality of compulsion. Each time he enters, he rehearses in silence the dialogue he cannot yet deliver. Each time he leaves, he is defeated by the very anxiety that drove him there. He is, in effect, conducting his own painful therapy without any awareness of what he is doing. Notice, too, the physicality of these visits. He often stands rather than sits, pacing or leaning awkwardly. His body language is stiff, shoulders hunched, hands clasped or behind his back. These are classic somatic signs of social anxiety. The nervous system locked in a fight-or-flight state, adrenaline without release. Elizabeth perceives arrogance in these stiff silences. Psychology perceives hyperarousal and physical containment. The paradox is most evident in the contrast between Darcy's interior life and his external behavior. Internally, he is overwhelmed by powerful emotions, eloquent thoughts, and moral calculations. Externally, he appears inert, rigid, even rude. This split is not uncommon in individuals with high-functioning anxiety. The mind races while the body freezes. To Elizabeth, the freeze reads as disdain. To Darcy, it is the only possible survival tactic. When at last he attempts to resolve this inner tension, the result is catastrophic: the first proposal. It is not structured as a romantic overture, but as a desperate confession, a torrent of pent-up emotion delivered in a manner more clinical than tender. He catalogues Elizabeth's social deficiencies almost as if he were submitting evidence before a tribunal, unable to distinguish between the logical reasons his mind has obsessed over and the emotional truth he intends to convey. The result is an implosion, a complete mismatch between intent and delivery. Elizabeth's rejection is, for Darcy, a shock bordering on trauma. He has finally exposed the vulnerable contents of his mind, something he has never risked before, only to have them interpreted as insults. The dissonance between his self-perception, a man making a courageous confession, and her perception, a man arrogantly demeaning her, is devastating. For the socially anxious, rejection does not merely sting, it confirms their worst fears. The world has seen them, and the world has judged them wanting. To understand Darcy's symptoms more fully, we must step into the language of psychoanalysis, where pride functions not as a moral flaw, but as a defense mechanism. Freud identified several ways the ego protects itself under pressure: projection, displacement, rationalization, and, most relevant here, intellectualization. Darcy intellectualizes his emotions. Instead of simply saying, "I am overwhelmed by feeling for you," he produces a list of rational objections, as though love were an equation to be solved. His pride is not cruelty. It is a shield of logic wielded against the chaos of feeling. Modern psychology provides further clarity. The DSM-5 describes socially anxious individuals as prone to overestimation of threat and underestimation of coping ability. Darcy embodies both. Every social encounter feels like a tribunal. Every silence feels like a verdict. His withdrawal into aloofness is therefore a rational response to what his brain misidentifies as overwhelming threat. The very grandeur of his estate, his wealth, his lineage, all of which should give him confidence, only amplify the stakes. The higher the pedestal, the farther the fall. This explains the paradox of his interactions. The more he feels for Elizabeth, the more paralyzed he becomes. His defenses escalate in proportion to his desire. At Netherfield, he circles her in silence. At Hunsford, he blurts his proposal in a flood of intellectualized argument. These are not the maneuvers of an arrogant strategist, but the coping strategies of a man cornered by his own emotions. Projection also plays its part. Consider his insistence on Bingley's unsuitability for Jane. On the surface, this appears as snobbish interference. But through the psychological lens, it is projection of his own fears. He cannot manage his feelings for Elizabeth, so he projects vulnerability onto his friend, rationalizing his intervention as protection. In truth, he is rehearsing his own anxieties under the guise of authority. Displacement is equally visible. When confronted with the intensity of his attraction, Darcy cannot express it directly. Instead, he displaces the energy into criticism of Elizabeth's family, of her social standing. By attacking external factors, he avoids naming the true source of turmoil, his own fragile emotional core. What Elizabeth experiences as insult is, in fact, a misdirected confession. Here, the metaphor of the fortress becomes essential. Pride is not the banner Darcy waves in triumph, but the wall behind which he hides. The fortress of Pemberley, vast and imposing, is the architectural analog of his psyche. Beautiful, grand, impenetrable, but profoundly lonely inside. The moat is pride. The drawbridge is silence. The battlements are rationalizations. Few are permitted entrance, and those who do wander its halls may find not arrogance but emptiness. The tragedy lies in misdiagnosis. Society, and for 2 centuries readers, have labeled this fortress arrogance. But modern psychology sees it differently. It is not a palace of superiority, but a bunker of fear. And once we recognize this, the figure of Darcy shifts. No longer the proud villain of a social comedy, but the anxious patient of a case study, a man who has armored himself so thoroughly that he cannot remember how to live unarmored. If one were to film Darcy's early appearances as pure arrogance, the camera would linger on sneers, elevated eyebrows, or deliberately cold gestures. But if the director approached it as social anxiety, the cinematic grammar would change. The lens might tighten into claustrophobic close-ups, emphasizing his clenched jaw, his restless hands, his inability to meet Elizabeth's gaze. The sound design could heighten the chatter of the ballroom into a suffocating drone, the scraping of chairs into thunderclaps, the ticking of a clock into a hammer. The audience would feel not superiority, but sensory overload. In this framing, Darcy becomes less a statue of disdain and more a man drowning in invisible noise. This perspective forces us to confront another uncomfortable truth. Readers themselves have been complicit in Darcy's misdiagnosis. For 2 centuries, the narrative of pride has persisted because it flatters the reader's position. To condemn Darcy as haughty is to affirm one's own moral clarity. But to recognize him as anxious is to recognize a reflection of ourselves, the awkward silences, the clumsy words, the defensive walls we build. His so-called arrogance becomes a mirror, and not all readers are prepared to see themselves in it. Thus, the symptoms we have examined are not isolated quirks of a fictional aristocrat, but the universal markers of social anxiety. Avoidance at the dance floor, silence mistaken for contempt, obsessive patterns of behavior, intellectualization of emotion, projection onto others, displacement into criticism, all belong not in the realm of vice, but in the lexicon of clinical psychology. When Elizabeth rejects him at Hunsford, the shock in his eyes is not the wounded pride of an aristocrat, but the bewilderment of a man who thought he had finally spoken his truth and instead discovered that his truth was illegible to others. It is the moment when the fortress collapses, when the defenses that once preserved him instead betray him. And it is the moment when our diagnostic lens shifts from proud to anxious, from villain to patient. To understand the man, one must first examine the child. The adult Darcy, frozen in reserve and girded with pride, did not emerge fully formed. He was shaped in the crucible of a childhood under relentless surveillance. Figures such as Lady Catherine de Bourgh represent more than domineering relatives. They embody the constant gaze of authority that scrutinized every gesture, every mistake, every hesitation. In developmental psychology, children who grow under perpetual evaluation often learn a brutal lesson. Safety comes only through perfection. Any stumble is not simply error, but failure. Any deviation is shame. From this soil grows a personality that values control above all else. Darcy's later obsession with dignity, composure, and propriety is less the mark of a confident aristocrat than the scar tissue of a boy who learned that affection and approval were conditional. Attachment theory sharpens the picture further. Early loss of his parents and the heavy responsibility of guardianship over Georgiana thrust Darcy prematurely into the role of protector. He became both shield and jailer, guarding his sister, guarding the estate, and, most insidiously, guarding his own emotions. Emotional openness was a liability, something that could expose him or others to harm. Better to close the gates, to lock feeling behind the walls of intellect and order. This context reframes the pride so often condemned. It was never about looking down on others. It was about never letting others look into him. His aloofness is camouflage. His hauteur is armor. From boyhood onward, Darcy internalized a single commandment: you must not fail. And because love is inherently risky, love itself became suspect. Thus, when Elizabeth Bennet enters his life, she does not merely challenge his heart, she threatens the very architecture of his psychological defenses. She sees through him. Her laughter unsettles him. Her refusal to be awed destabilizes the carefully balanced structure of dignity and control. For the first time since childhood, Darcy is not shielded by role or status. He is simply a man, visible, vulnerable, and profoundly unprepared. If Darcy's childhood had locked him behind walls of pride, the infamous letter to Elizabeth acted as the first fissure in those walls. Readers often treat the letter as a narrative device, a convenient way to deliver exposition about Wickham and Georgiana. Yet psychologically, it functions as Darcy's first act of unfiltered self-revelation. Until that point, he had spoken in guarded tones, his words sharpened into weapons or dulled into courtesies. The proposal at Hunsford was the culmination of this mode. Passion clothed in arrogance, desire distorted by fear of rejection. But Elizabeth's vehement refusal and scathing rebuke cut deeper than wounded pride. They threatened his very self-concept. If his dignity was armor, then Elizabeth's words pierced it with precision. She accused him not merely of arrogance, but of injustice, of moral failure. For a man whose identity was anchored in control, the accusation was shattering. He could not dismiss her as ignorant. Her judgment mattered. And so he turned, for the first time, to vulnerability. The letter was his attempt to seize control while paradoxically relinquishing it. In placing his narrative before Elizabeth, he exposed his private fears and failures, his role in separating Bingley from Jane, his fraught history with Wickham, his anxieties over Georgiana's reputation. From a therapeutic lens, the letter resembles catharsis writing, a structured outpouring of suppressed emotion and truth. Clinical studies on expressive writing, such as James Pennebaker's research, suggest that articulating trauma and guilt in written form can reorganize emotional memory, transforming chaos into coherence. Darcy, unknowingly, engaged in such a process. His defenses, built since childhood, cracked not through external assault, but through self-expression. Elizabeth's response, her silence during the reading, her later reflection that she had been blind and prejudiced, completed the cycle. For the first time, Darcy's honesty was not punished. Instead, it catalyzed transformation in both parties. In developmental terms, the letter served as a corrective emotional experience. He risked openness and was met eventually with understanding rather than scorn. This was the turning point not simply of the romance, but of Darcy's inner life. From that moment, pride ceased to be his master and began to be his mask, something he could remove, at least with Elizabeth. The man who once equated vulnerability with danger now discovered that vulnerability could be the bridge to connection. The true measure of psychological transformation is not in words, but in behavior. Darcy's letter marked an inner shift, but the outward evidence emerges most vividly at Pemberley. The estate functions symbolically. It is the externalization of his identity, the physical manifestation of his lineage. Elizabeth has not only reawakened his capacity for love, she has taught him that true strength is not in vulnerability, but the courage to risk rejection and still extend kindness. The most profound test of Darcy's transformation arrives not in drawing rooms, but in crisis. Lydia Bennet's elopement with Wickham threatens not only Elizabeth's family reputation, but also the fragile hope of reconciliation between Darcy and Elizabeth. For Darcy, the scandal is more than a social embarrassment. It is a mirror reflecting his deepest fears. Wickham, the reckless figure from his past, resurfaces to endanger the woman he loves. What distinguishes Darcy's response from his earlier self is the manner in which he acts. The old Darcy, armored in pride, might have condemned the Bennet family and withdrawn to protect his dignity. Instead, the new Darcy intervenes quietly, decisively, and selflessly. He tracks Wickham, negotiates terms, provides financial support, and ensures Lydia's marriage, yet all without seeking credit. His actions are not performed for gratitude, reputation, or leverage. They are acts of love, pure and sacrificial. From a psychological perspective, this is the culmination of his shift from control to care. Earlier, Darcy equated responsibility with domination. He controlled Bingley's choices, policed Georgiana's behavior, and sought to manage Elizabeth's acceptance through persuasion. In the Lydia crisis, responsibility is redefined as protection without possession. He shoulders the burden while respecting Elizabeth's autonomy, leaving her to learn of his deeds indirectly. This hidden intervention also marks Darcy's reconciliation with vulnerability. By entangling himself with the Bennet's scandal, he risks his own reputation. Such a move would once have been unthinkable for a man obsessed with maintaining dignity. But love has reframed his priorities. The preservation of Elizabeth's happiness outweighs the preservation of his own image. Narratively, this act restores balance between them. Elizabeth, humbled by her misjudgments, is now able to perceive Darcy's true nature. Darcy, freed from the compulsion to appear flawless, demonstrates his worth through action rather than posture. Their union, when it finally arrives, is not the triumph of one over the other, but the integration of vulnerability and pride into a mature partnership. Marriage, in Pride and Prejudice, is not merely a social arrangement, but the symbolic resolution of two psychological journeys. For Darcy, it represents the culmination of his transformation, the integration of pride and vulnerability into a coherent self. At the novel's beginning, Darcy's identity was fragmented. Pride functioned as armor, love as threat, and responsibility as burden. By the end, these elements are harmonized. His dignity remains intact, but it no longer isolates him. It anchors him. His vulnerability, once hidden, is now shared with Elizabeth, creating intimacy rather than shame. Responsibility, formerly wielded as control, is redefined as mutual support. He protects not by dominating, but by partnering. From the lens of attachment theory, Darcy achieves what psychologists call earned, secure attachment. He was not raised in a context that nurtured such security. Early loss, surveillance, and high expectations bred avoidance and self-protection. But through his bond with Elizabeth, he learns that love does not equate to danger. Risking rejection, risking exposure, he discovers that intimacy can be a source of strength rather than weakness. This transformation is not absolute perfection. Pride does not vanish, nor does vulnerability become effortless. What changes is the dynamic between them. Darcy can now laugh at his former stiffness, admit his mistakes, and invite Elizabeth into spaces once closed. Elizabeth, in turn, tempers his dignity with warmth and grounds his intensity with wit. Together they embody a balance, intellect and emotion, responsibility and freedom, pride and love. The significance of this resolution extends beyond romance. Austen suggests that true character growth arises when psychological defenses are not destroyed but reoriented. Darcy does not shed his pride, he redeems it. Vulnerability does not consume him, it liberates him. Their marriage is thus not only a union of two people but a testament to the possibility of healing. The idea that even deeply ingrained defenses can evolve when met with honesty, courage, and affection. In the end, Darcy is not less proud but more whole, and in becoming whole, he becomes capable of love, not as a concession to weakness, but as the highest expression of strength. The first proposal had been a disaster, not because Darcy lacked feeling, but because he lacked fluency and vulnerability. He confessed his love as though it were a courtroom deposition, cataloging obstacles and violations of social codes, reducing passion to pathology. Elizabeth rightly rejected such a performance. The second proposal is something else entirely. It is not a grand speech rehearsed in solitude, nor a list of grievances disguised as confession. It is quiet, tentative, stripped of the armor of pride and the compulsive need to justify. Darcy does not approach Elizabeth as an embattled aristocrat defending his choices, but as a man willing to risk exposure. Here the tone shifts from confrontation to dialogue. Where once he dominated the air with declarations, he now leaves space for her voice. He acknowledges her influence, not as a threat to his autonomy, but as the catalyst for his growth. His words are not an argument, but a recognition that she has taught him humility and that he has allowed himself to learn. Psychologically, this moment is transformative because Darcy redefines vulnerability. In the first proposal, vulnerability meant shame and failure. To admit affection was to admit loss of control. In the second, vulnerability becomes connection. His declaration is no longer a cry of personal suffering, but an invitation to partnership. He speaks not to be absolved, but to be understood. This subtle but profound shift reframes the very concept of pride. Pride is no longer the wall that separates him from others. It is the quiet dignity with which he can now stand beside Elizabeth as her equal. Vulnerability is no longer the sickness he must conceal. It is the bridge that allows love to flow freely. And crucially, Elizabeth does not merely accept him because he has changed. She accepts him because he has revealed himself. The man who once seemed arrogant and cold is now transparent. His defenses lowered not by defeat, but by choice. This is not the triumph of romance over pride, but the transformation of pride into a new form, self-respect, open to love. In this reimagined proposal, Austen offers one of literature's rarest gifts, a portrait of love not as conquest, but as mutual recognition. Darcy's healing begins here, not in being cured, but in embracing the paradox that strength lies in the willingness to be seen. It is tempting to read the conclusion of Pride and Prejudice as a fairy tale cure. Darcy overcomes his pride, wins Elizabeth, and lives happily ever after. But such a reading diminishes both Austen's realism and the psychological truth embedded in her narrative. Anxiety of the depth Darcy exhibits is not something one simply sheds like an old coat. It lingers, it reshapes itself, it remains a constant companion. What changes is not its existence, but his relationship to it. Darcy will never be the life of the party. Balls will always exhaust him. Small talk will remain a chore. His silences will not vanish, nor will his tendency toward overanalysis. Yet the difference lies in perception. What once appeared as arrogance now reads as temperament. Elizabeth, knowing him fully, does not demand transformation into a social butterfly. She offers acceptance of his quieter rhythms. From a modern clinical perspective, this represents not cure, but adaptation. High-functioning social anxiety rarely dissolves. Instead, individuals build coping mechanisms, creating safe spaces, forging deep but selective relationships, learning when to withdraw and when to step forward. Darcy's marriage provides precisely this environment. Pemberley becomes not only an estate, but a sanctuary, a place where he can retreat without shame and emerge without fear. Elizabeth plays a central role here, not as healer, but as witness. She does not cure him. Love does not erase pathology, but she reframes his inner world. By validating his worth apart from performance, she reduces the constant pressure that fuels anxiety. Her presence allows him to risk more frequent authenticity, to experiment with vulnerability without the looming dread of judgment. The first proposal had been a disaster, not because Darcy lacked feeling, but because he lacked fluency and vulnerability. He confessed his love as though it were a courtroom deposition, cataloging obstacles and violations of social codes, reducing passion to pathology. Elizabeth rightly rejected such a performance. The second proposal is something else entirely. It is not a grand speech rehearsed in solitude, nor a list of grievances disguised as confession. It is quiet, tentative, stripped of the armor of pride and the compulsive need to justify. Darcy does not approach Elizabeth as an embattled aristocrat defending his choices, but as a man willing to risk exposure. Here the tone shifts from confrontation to dialogue. Where once he dominated the air with declarations, he now leaves space for her voice. He acknowledges her influence, not as a threat to his autonomy, but as the catalyst for his growth. His words are not an argument, but a recognition that she has taught him humility and that he has allowed himself to learn. Psychologically, this moment is transformative because Darcy redefines vulnerability. In the first proposal, vulnerability meant shame and failure. To admit affection was to admit loss of control. In the second, vulnerability becomes connection. His declaration is no longer a cry of personal suffering, but an invitation to partnership. He speaks not to be absolved, but to be understood. This subtle but profound shift reframes the very concept of pride. Pride is no longer the wall that separates him from others. It is the quiet dignity with which he can now stand beside Elizabeth as her equal. Vulnerability is no longer the sickness he must conceal. It is the bridge that allows love to flow freely. And crucially, Elizabeth does not merely accept him because he has changed. She accepts him because he has revealed himself. The man who once seemed arrogant and cold is now transparent. His defenses lowered not by defeat, but by choice. This is not the triumph of romance over pride, but the transformation of pride into a new form, self-respect, open to love. In this reimagined proposal, Austen offers one of literature's rarest gifts, a portrait of love not as conquest, but as mutual recognition. Darcy's healing begins here, not in being cured, but in embracing the paradox that strength lies in the willingness to be seen. It is tempting to read the conclusion of Pride and Prejudice as a fairy tale cure. Darcy overcomes his pride, wins Elizabeth, and lives happily ever after. But such a reading diminishes both Austen's realism and the psychological truth embedded in her narrative. Anxiety of the depth Darcy exhibits is not something one simply sheds like an old coat. It lingers, it reshapes itself, it remains a constant companion. What changes is not its existence, but his relationship to it. Darcy will never be the life of the party. Balls will always exhaust him. Small talk will remain a chore. His silences will not vanish, nor will his tendency toward overanalysis. Yet the difference lies in perception. What once appeared as arrogance now reads as temperament. Elizabeth, knowing him fully, does not demand transformation into a social butterfly. She offers acceptance of his quieter rhythms. From a modern clinical perspective, this represents not cure, but adaptation. High-functioning social anxiety rarely dissolves. Instead, individuals build coping mechanisms, creating safe spaces, forging deep but selective relationships, learning when to withdraw and when to step forward. Darcy's marriage provides precisely this environment. Pemberley becomes not only an estate, but a sanctuary, a place where he can retreat without shame and emerge without fear. Elizabeth plays a central role here, not as healer, but as witness. She does not cure him. Love does not erase pathology, but she reframes his inner world. By validating his worth apart from performance, she reduces the constant pressure that fuels anxiety. Her presence allows him to risk more frequent authenticity, to experiment with vulnerability without the looming dread of judgment. Darcy's struggle cannot be separated from the society in which he lived. Regency England was a world obsessed with appearances, lineage, and unspoken rules of decorum. Within such a system, a man of Darcy's temperament was doubly burdened. His wealth and position demanded effortless sociability, yet his nature recoiled from the very settings that displayed it. The ballroom, the dinner table, the country assembly, these were not neutral spaces, but psychological minefields. In this sense, Darcy's so-called pride was a cultural misdiagnosis. The society around him lacked the vocabulary to interpret social withdrawal as anything but disdain. There was no framework for understanding introversion, much less chronic anxiety. To stand silently by the wall was to appear judgmental. To speak little was to be accused of coldness. To leave early was to be branded arrogant. Darcy became a prisoner not only of his own defenses, but of collective misunderstanding. Fast forward 2 centuries, and the resonance of this misreading is startling. In today's world of constant networking, digital visibility, and performative charisma, Darcy would face similar accusations. The professional who avoids after-work drinks, the student who sits quietly in class, the colleague who dreads video calls, such people are often still judged as aloof or unfriendly. The language of team player or outgoing personality echoes the same cultural script that once condemned Darcy. What Austen captures, then, is not just an individual case, but a social pathology. The tendency of communities to misinterpret anxiety as arrogance, silence as superiority, awkwardness as rejection. This diagnosis extends far beyond the walls of Pemberley, pointing toward a broader cultural blindness. Society, both then and now, often valorizes extroversion while stigmatizing hesitation. Seen this way, Pride and Prejudice functions almost as an early ethnography of social anxiety. It documents not only the private turmoil of an individual, but the collective failure to recognize it. Elizabeth herself is guilty of this misdiagnosis, though her eventual correction dramatizes the possibility of societal growth. By learning to see Darcy differently, she models the shift from prejudice to empathy. For modern readers, this becomes a powerful reminder. Behind many masks of pride may lie unspoken fear. Behind detachment, a desperate longing to connect. Austen's novel therefore anticipates contemporary movements in psychology and mental health advocacy. The push to destigmatize anxiety, to replace judgment with curiosity, and to acknowledge the silent battles that shape human behavior. Darcy's healing, then, is not only personal. It gestures toward a collective project, learning to interpret silence with compassion rather than suspicion. The ballroom becomes a metaphor for society itself, always noisy, always demanding performance, and Darcy becomes the figure who teaches us to ask not, why is he so proud, but what is he enduring in silence? Why does Mr. Darcy's story continue to resonate across centuries, cultures, and languages? The answer lies in the archetypal dimension of his struggle. Beneath the silk waistcoats and Regency manners, Darcy embodies a universal conflict, the tension between the longing for connection and the terror of exposure. This conflict transcends time. Ancient myths often featured heroes whose strength concealed a hidden wound. Achilles with his vulnerable heel, Hercules with his moments of madness, Odysseus with his crippling homesickness. Darcy belongs to this lineage. His wound is not physical, but psychological, and it is invisible to most. He carries within him the modern myth of the anxious hero, one whose greatest battles are not fought on battlefields, but in drawing rooms, across dance floors, and within the chambers of his own mind. Carl Jung described archetypes as recurring symbols of human experience. Darcy can be seen as the archetype of the wounded king or reluctant hero. His nobility is unquestioned, yet his reign over his own emotions falters. His journey mirrors the path many take in the face of anxiety, hiding behind masks, constructing fortresses of competence, fearing the collapse of carefully maintained control. His ultimate healing, through Elizabeth's recognition, reflects the archetypal theme of integration, where shadow and self are reconciled. On a more intimate level, readers see themselves in Darcy's awkward silences, his failed first confession, his clumsy attempts to bridge the gap between inner feeling and outer expression. Who has not stumbled in the moment of truth? Who has not hidden behind pride to mask insecurity? Darcy magnifies these small human experiences into epic scale, showing us that our private humiliations are part of a collective drama. This archetypal resonance also explains why Darcy's character is constantly reinvented in modern culture. From film adaptations to contemporary retellings in novels, dramas, and even romantic comedies. He persists not because audiences adore aristocrats, but because they recognize the deeper struggle, the yearning to be loved for one's true self, beneath the defenses built to survive a judgmental world. In this way, Darcy ceases to be merely a character. He becomes a mirror. Each generation sees in him the same fragile courage required to step out from behind the mask, to risk rejection in pursuit of intimacy. His pride is our pride, his silence our silence, his trembling vulnerability our own. Thus, the archetype of Darcy is both timeless and timely. It reassures us that anxiety does not disqualify us from love or respect. Instead, it may be the very condition that makes our eventual connection more profound. In watching Darcy stumble, falter, and finally reveal himself, we are reminded that our struggles, too, can end not in shame, but in recognition. When we close the final page of Pride and Prejudice, it is tempting to remember only the romance. The proud man humbled, the witty woman vindicated, the happy union sealed. Yet beneath the surface lies something far more enduring. Austen has given us in Darcy not just a love interest, but a case study, a portrait of how human beings wrestle with hidden afflictions, and how healing can occur not in isolation, but in relationship. Darcy's journey reframes the way we think about pride, anxiety, and vulnerability. What began as a mask of superiority is revealed as a shield against fear. What seemed like arrogance becomes the trembling silence of a man overwhelmed by the world's demands. His story demonstrates that personal transformation is rarely about eradicating weakness. Instead, it is about learning to reinterpret weakness as humanity and to build bridges where once there were walls. This case study also reminds us of the power of perception. For 2 centuries, readers misdiagnosed Darcy as haughty. Only by shifting the lens, from judgment to empathy, from stereotype to psychology, do we see the fuller truth. In this sense, Austen's novel anticipates the modern call for mental health awareness. To recognize that beneath behaviors we may dismiss or condemn often lies unspoken struggle. The love story, then, is not a decorative subplot, but the crucible of this transformation. Elizabeth does not cure Darcy, nor does she demand his reinvention. Instead, she forces him to confront the gap between his self-perception and the world's perception. She holds a mirror, and in doing so, allows him to reconcile his inner chaos with his outer identity. Their marriage is less about the triumph of passion and more about the triumph of authenticity. In the end, the case of Mr. Darcy is not just a literary reinterpretation, but a timeless parable. It teaches us that healing does not mean perfection, that vulnerability is not weakness, and that love, at its best, creates a space safe enough for the most guarded parts of ourselves to emerge. Darcy's silence becomes eloquence, his pride becomes dignity, his anxiety becomes humanity. 200 years later, his story still speaks to us because it is, in truth, our story. We too build fortresses of pride. We too fear exposure. And we too long for someone to see us not as arrogant or cold, but as complicated, wounded, and worthy of love. Thus, the final diagnosis is clear. Mr. Darcy is not the villain of Pride and Prejudice. He is its most modern patient, a man whose healing shows us that even the most impenetrable fortress can, with courage and connection, become a home.